So here's a few more things that we need to look at on the fill settings. There is an opacity, there's gradients as we saw, there's a mode, and all that is very similar to what you have for the paintbrush itself. When you look at the brush tools, you got the opacity here, and so when you paint with less opacity, you don't see it too well, and then when you paint with higher opacity, it's much more opaque. And there is also the mode in the paintbrush. You can do an additive, so as you paint over it, it gets even brighter, or you can do a subtractive, and as you paint over it, it subtracts it. If you combine that with the opacity, it's going to subtract it only a little bit, little by little, and as you paint over it many more times, it will eventually bring it down to really dark. Alright, so the similar parameters exist in the fill settings, and they are here by themselves. So you can have high opacity on the brush but low opacity on the fill tool, and vice versa. Let's in fact do just that now. Let's go grab the gradients. Let's grab one of the cool gradients we have here in the presets. Let's see, what do we want here? Maybe one of the rainbow colors, or there, let's take this one. And let's use the fill tool in fully opaque mode. Okay, and right now it's in plain color fill. Let's go with the gradient from left to right, and there we go. Okay, we don't need this one for now. So we now have the gradient going from left to right. Let's go again from left to right inside the gradient. Click that, no change, because the tolerance is at the maximum. If I reduce the tolerance, it's going to be contained in a very small area. Okay, because the gradient now can only go so far with the tolerance. Alright, here is a few more, and of course that's going to be quite interesting also with another tool. The fill tool is one way to use the fill patterns, gradients or textures, but there's a couple of others. There is a few more tools here. Circular gradient, perhaps with a lot more on the up. Let's go to full spread there. One thing that you can see here is that when you apply these other tools, there's a couple of tools here that use a gradient as well for filling, but not just filling based on the shape. But so there's a couple of other options there. There's the linear gradient tool and the circular gradient. So with that, you can go and take whatever gradient you have here, or modify, create your own, and then fill that. So that's an interesting one to use as a starting point. Let's say you want to have a horizon line with some hazy fog. There's a couple of presets there that are quite interesting to use exactly for that purpose. Load some skies, picture frames, gun medals, and so on. And some of these colors, some of these gradients will look just fabulous to create, you know, for instance, something like the edge on a planet, and then you got some atmospheric layer and haze or something like that there. So that would be one to use as well with the fill tool, of course, and the gradient. Let's see, for instance, how to use the gradients and the fill tool together in something like text. If you're using that to create some fancy logos, let's go back to the one we had here. In fact, I'm going to use another one here. This one is a friend of mine called Fabrice. He runs a French restaurant called Fabrizons, and his website is fabrizons.com. So what we'll do is we'll actually use an even larger font, perhaps 72, and make this big enough so we can see it all. There you go. Alright, so again, let's render that with the text tool. Here we are, into the alpha channel. There we go, and apply that. Now you might be shifted because I may have some scaling in effect or some others, but the transform, we can certainly move this thing back and correct it to place it exactly where we want it. Alright, so at this time, this alpha channel or this selection we can use with the fill tool, just like we saw earlier. So for instance, let's pick the purple lake color and go with the full tolerance and plain color mode, and and it will fill it right there. All right, now let's go and grow. Remember how we can use the grow tools in the selection to grow an outline around that. Before we do that, we want to store the alpha channel, so we have that here and handy available in case we need it again. There you go. So now we go to the alpha and select grow alpha. We're going to make I don't know, 5 or 8 pixels beyond it, so it goes bigger. And then we'll take this original and subtract it. Okay, before we do that, we might want to still store this one as well. All right, and so now we subtract it. So we now have just the outlines selected. You can see that there's some marching ants going around this edge and then some more around here. Okay, so we can now go and fill that with perhaps a gradient going from left to right. And whatever gradient it is that we currently have, we should be able to see here. It's kind of similar to the one we had there in the background, so we may need to change that. It would be good to perhaps invert it at least, like so. That in many cases will give us a better contrast, but then of course we could actually make it a totally different gradient, like for instance something like this. Or let's see what else, this one here. Okay, and then we can also emboss that. Let's see, selection, embossed by alpha, something like this. And so there it is. That gives us some more sophisticated text elements that we can do thanks to the fill tool with the gradients. Let's see, what else could we do here? Perhaps we want to draw some shapes that we want to. Oh yeah, we love the French food right there. So let's draw a heart over this. In fact, what I'll do is I'll pick the whole thing up here as a custom brush, or at least I store the whole image. Let's go to image and store it. There you go. And we don't need the alpha channel for that anymore, so Control D here, and let's just let's see, what do we want to do? We'd want to draw a heart on top of that, so let's go, actually let's use the tool we used earlier, the curve tool, right? And we'll erase the background there, and then we'll just draw our heart with a couple of points in the path in the curve tool. So we go from here to here to over here, one more, and it starts becoming a spline interpolation. There you go. Then we go kind of symmetrically to the other side. Doesn't have to be perfectly symmetrical for this one. I'm sure we could actually find ways to make that a perfect symmetry with this tool as well. Close it, make sure it's a closed loop. Use the move tool so we can reposition some of these points. Something like this. And there you go. Okay, and so this is now going to be the outline that we want to fill with some texture pattern perhaps. So what do we need to do? We need to make sure we render that either with the fill tool, and if there's any sort of fill options like the gradient in effect or a texture pattern, it's gonna fill it with that. For instance, here, let's take the pattern fill and fill it, and there you go. Or perhaps we have the circular gradient that we want, but not at full intensity, or maybe the vertical gradient, maybe the opacity a little bit down, and fill it again. And now it's bringing that gradient on top of it. Circular gradient, fill it again. Okay, now for that one, it's going to give us a little bit of a radiance selector. We can, or a radius, so we can indicate which way this thing is going to be centered and how far it's going to reach with those circular gradient. Anyway, so that's one way that we can create this. We can also render it into the alpha channel. That would be here. Then that way we can just pick this entire image up, pick this selection into the brush. There you go. Use selected as brush. And we can now store that brush, like here, and you see it against a transparent background. And actually with some no, it doesn't have the transparency, it's the pattern in it there. And let's see what else. Alright, well then we go back to the image we had in there, click it, that's the stored image. And we want to bring the brush on top of that. That would be a little bit difficult to paint right there without covering up the text. So we may need to do this in a different sequence, in a different order. Alright, like for instance, we could first draw the heart and then draw the other text on top of that. Or perhaps use a selection mask still to make sure the text doesn't get erased by the heart. Let's do it this way. Let's go here. Right, so we have this, and then we replace the selection mask. Actually, that one is not the one we stored for every. This is the one we want to use. Replace that, so we now have the selection on the inside, and we really need the inverse of that, so we can reverse or invert the alpha. So now we have selected everything around it. All right, and now we can go with the opacity on the brush and actually paint the brush right in here. If you want to preview where the brush is going to be, go right here with the preview mode, and that will tell you where the brush is. But it's not going to paint inside of the, outside of the selection mask. It's only going to paint on the inside. So you see that right there. Actually, I did a double click there, so let's go undo that a little bit. There you go. Maybe a little bit smaller. Let's make this brush a tad bit smaller. There you go, and put one this way. Hello. Oh, it's on the inside. Hold on. I did too many undos. So let's grab the selection here. Let's get the alpha. Yeah, that's the wrong one. Undo that. Ah, I didn't keep a safe copy of the other one, and that's exactly why we need it. Okay, so let's just grow it ourselves again. Replace this, and then selection, grow it. What was it? 8 pixels or something like that. Grow the alpha. It was about 8 pixels that we grew it. I'm sure that will allow us to grow it back. Okay, so let's use this one first, and then grow there. There you go. Now we are all the way back to the outline. Make sure we grab this, get the alpha, so we have the fat version there, and invert it. Replace it, so now we can put one heart over here, and it's not going to cover the text. And then perhaps I'm going to use a vertical mirror, or split it up, upside down, flip it. That's with the Y key, or you can do that under the brush. Flip vertical, that's the Y key. X for horizontal, Y for vertical. Right. So I'm just using the keyboard shortcut here, and that would be like this. There you go. Now, oh, perhaps one thing we can do there, of course, to give it a little bit more depth or definition, is to add the brush option. Where is it? For the shadow drop. Post effects. Since this is a custom brush, we can enable the shadow drop for that. Like 13. Lucky number. Blur it. And see that. Yeah, that gives us a nice little shadow drop. So we can do that on the other one as well. Yep, there's one with the shadow. Perhaps a little bit more blur on that. Undo, undo, there you go. So one here, and then vertical, and one there. Alrighty. And that's already it.